Welcome back, everybody, to the next episode of How to Get Away with Staffing. My name is Colin LeBeau, president at Foxhire, employer of record platform in the United States. And I've got a great person on my team, Julie Majors, here to talk all things EOR RFPs. Hey, Julie, how are you?
I'm good. Hey, thanks for having me, Colin.
Of course. Um, Exciting topic. It's about the season that RFP requests go out for January 1st starts on new RFP or EOR implementations, all the acronyms. So I thought it'd be a great time to chat about architecting the best EOR RFP process for those that might be doing it for the first time. So if you don't mind, maybe give the people that are watching just a little bit on your background and sort of the experience you've had with RFPs in general.
Yeah, so I'm the contracts manager here at Foxhire, and my primary function is to review and negotiate the agreements that Foxhire sets up with the clients when we make a contract placement. Specifically regarding the RFPs, Foxhire's been completing RFPs probably for 20 years. I've worked on probably close to 100 of those. So we've got extensive experience with completing those RFPs for sure.
Yes, we're trying to come into this with your background in the most unbiased way possible, just to help those that might be doing an RFP for EOR services to get a head start, understand the right things to do, the things to stay away from, and understanding this space in general, because EORs and our employer of record space is sort of been reborn in the last couple of years. And so the understanding of like what we do is still a little bit uh, not completely aligned with some of what the buyers think we do, and can be confused with other solutions that exist out there, like staffing firms or PEOs and things like that. So, I think that's really the first thing we got to talk about is just like setting the stage for what you're actually trying to buy, especially if you've never really engaged with an EOR in the past. You really want to understand, like, define why are you looking for an employer of record? Because there are a number of employers of record that service all types of different use cases, as well as indirect competitors or sort of companies that do some of what EORs do or do it differently. Like I said, PEOs and staffing firms that you want to make sure you're either filtering in, if that's what you want, or filtering out in your RFP process. So really, let's just start with like defining what an employer of record is. And I'll start by saying there's two general types of employer of record services. The first of which is probably what you've been finding if you've been searching for employer of record, either on Google or talking to people, which is sort of this global use case, right? Employer of record meaning a vendor that will employ workers on your behalf in other countries, right? So maybe you're based in the United States and you want to employ people in 5 different countries. A global employer of record will be a great fit for that, right? So there's that population of employer of record, right? There's a number of vendors that you can find that do that. Then there's this other use case for employer of record, which is a contingent workforce use case. That can be global, but most of the time it's in a region, right? United States or EMEA, right? And those EORs are very different from the global EORs, right? The global EORs focus on full-time worker use cases, and the contingent worker EORs focus on temporary contract, gig worker use cases, but they still offer the same thing, right? The employer of record becomes the employer of those individuals, but to do either one of those use cases, you've got to be set up completely differently, right? So I think that's important for people to understand. That there are sort of two types of EORs. You want to understand which type you're looking for because there's different populations of vendors that support each. Right? I know that, Julie, you've gotten a lot of RFPs, and I'm sure you've seen some confusion there from buyers. Have you seen any confusion around either what an EOR does or how they're set up based off of what I just mentioned, the global versus contingent style?
Yeah, I've definitely seen a combination of those parameters within the RFPs, and I think it's a very important distinction that the EORs need to understand and the clients need to understand, because if there's confusion where the RFP originates, it's going to be confusing for the different EORs that are working on those RFPs. I've seen some that mention those words PEO, and we're
Yep.
not, not entirely sure that they really understand how that term is utilized throughout the RFP, and it can cause some confusion if it's not understood at the client where they're originating those RFPs to begin with, for sure.
Yep. And a PEO is a completely different solution than an EOR. It seems very similar, right? A lot of the things that PEOs do are the things that EORs do. But the main distinction as a buyer that I want you to walk away with is that a PEO offers a co-employment relationship, which is a legal employment structure in the United States only, by the way. No other countries legally approve of co-employment. So if you're buying global PEO services, that's a marketing exercise for that vendor. It is not PEO because by definition, that's co-employment. So that's the main difference between EOR. EOR is an employment relationship where the employer of record vendor takes on the full responsibility of employment. They don't co-employ with the client, and then they lease that employee back to the client organization, in so doing, taking on all of the employment risk. Whereas a PEO is co-employing, basically saying, we will take on these very narrow defined employment responsibilities like delivering payroll and benefits, but you are taking responsibility for everything else. And that can vary, that everything else can vary from PEO to PEO, but a PEO is not an EOR in most cases and vice versa. So knowing that difference is important for sure. And Julie, what are some of the other misconceptions that you see that are common when you're reviewing some of the RFPs for EOR services?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions that's out there is that every EOR service is the same. The EORs definitely have the same primary function, which is obviously, as you mentioned, to be the legal employer and take care of the paperwork and all the legal requirements. But depending on the different types of businesses that the EOR support, they're definitely not all the same. We talked in our last conversation about how certain EORs specialize in the types of business that they support. So it's definitely not the case that all EORs are the same. That's for certain.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the types of businesses I think is the most important thing to clarify there, right? Like you want to look for the EORs that focus in your niche, right? So if you're a technology business, focus on EORs that support technology. If you're a healthcare business, those EORs that support healthcare are going to have a much different infrastructure than EORs that don't. And you're going to be able to suss that out in the EOR process by asking things like, do you carry workers' comp for healthcare workers? Do you have the proper licensing to employ healthcare workers? Is your time and attendance system built for the healthcare industry, for things like on-call and shift differential, right? Same goes for education or any other industry that has niche specific oil and gas, right? Requirements. You want to focus on the EORs that are going to be able to deliver that and try to find those that can support that use case. Otherwise, your EOR process is going to be sort of futile. You're not going to end up vetting out the right vendors. So those, I also think I would just add one more thing. Another misconception is that not only are all EORs the same, but they price their services the same.
That's a good one. Very
Right.
good.
We don't all price our services the same, and there's a really good reason for that. And I'll just sort of expand upon that a little bit. The global use case prices their services on a monthly flat fee model. And that works really well for two reasons. Usually they're employing workers internationally, and payroll cycles, not US based, in other countries outside of the United States, typically function on a month to month payroll schedule. You get paid once a month. So a monthly flat fee works really well because you process payroll once, you send out one invoice to your clients for the fee and the payroll and the statutory costs, right? And you're good. However, on the contingent side, US side, the US market doesn't pay people on a monthly basis usually. It's usually either weekly or biweekly, right? And additionally, there's other types of calculations for pay. It's not all salary, like many, not all, but many international markets are. It's salary once a month. US, it can be hourly, weekly, hourly, biweekly. It could be salary, weekly or biweekly, right? So there's so many different ways that you can deliver payroll, it's difficult to apply a monthly flat fee to that, especially if you're not going to be working full time, right? If it's a temporary contract job, which a lot of the contingent EORs work on, these workers are getting paid by the hour. And so clients don't want to pay a flat fee per month, especially if they're not working full time, right? So you get into all that prorating and those types of challenges. Most contingent EORs deliver their pricing on a percentage of payroll basis, right? However much payroll you push through our platform as an EOR, we're going to charge you a percentage of that as the fee, right? 20%, something around that number, 30%, right? Is the cost, and that includes the statutory costs and their fee to make a profit. So understanding how EORs price based on your use case is really important. Otherwise, you're going to have them start to propose services and they're not going to price the way you want, or they will pull out of it because they don't want to price the way you want them to price, or you're going to have some just weird, funky stuff around pricing. That's really good to sort of look into before you ask for proposals. So big misconception there that we're all pricing the way these global vendors price because that's what you see online. That's not always the case. So ask some questions about that. But let's say
Yeah,
you
that's
do that.
definitely.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Julie.
I was gonna say, yes, that's definitely a good topic to bring up for sure.
Yeah, you don't want to have to go have your vendors come back to you and say, hey, like, we don't want to do this because you're making us price this way, and ask for exceptions and all these things. And then everybody's sort of confused what's going on. So you want to build that out beforehand before you send out the RFP. Maybe you have some calls with vendors to see how do they price, right? Don't just send out the RFP without having any conversations. But let's say you get to that point and you're starting to plan for the RFP itself. You've gotten through some of those misconceptions. You feel really comfortable. What are some of the most important maybe goals or things to consider and clarify before writing the RFP if you've sort of gotten through some of those other misconceptions?
I think it's very important for that client company to sit down, meet with all of their different strategic departments to really determine like what their requirements are going to be for the RFP. Like what are their goals that they're trying to accomplish? Um, and I think, that's going to vary based on each individual client and their needs. But that is a key component to what they need to do to develop this RFP. And I think they also need to establish a realistic time frame. I can't stress how important it is that they stick to that time frame as much as possible, not just for themselves to get them through the RFP process, but also for their prospective EOR vendors that are also, invested in their time to complete these RFPs.
Yeah.
And shift schedules around and meet the deadline. So I think the realistic time frame is very critical as well.
Yeah, timeline's super important. Setting your goal for a timeline is probably one of the most important things. A number of different uh, calendar events to consider is like, what is your fiscal year, right? When you're moving to an EOR, that's going to impact people's W-2s. Some people don't like getting 2 W-2s in a year. Other people don't care, right? So talk about that. How is the experience for the worker going to be if we do this mid-year versus Jan 1 or whatever your fiscal year is as well? Then also think about open enrollment, right? So most EOR vendors have an open enrollment period at some point. It's at times a lot easier to get through that process if it's part of the greater EOR open enrollment cycle versus a separate one because you're joining off cycle. And then big things that are happening in your company, right? I can't tell you how many times we get delays because clients like, well, we bought 3 things at once. And so now we have to implement this one and then we'll get to the EOR later. And that delays a lot of the stuff, and communication and those types of things can get stagnant. Then they circle back later on and they're like, wait, what did we agree to? I forgot, right? So those are things that I think you really want to consider as far as timeline is concerned. There might be a number of other things that other people in your organization could care about too. So Julie, you mentioned getting the right stakeholders involved. What are the typical groups that you see on calls for for RFPs or that have an influence on the process?
Yeah, you're definitely going to see the HR team on the call for certain. They are the ones that are establishing like the onboarding requirements. You're also going to see typically finance on those calls because they're the ones that care about the bottom dollar. You're going to see their tech side on there as well because, they want to see what your technology is when they're, looking at the different EORs. And sometimes you do see legal on those calls as well because they want to make sure that they are definitely working with an EOR that is dotting the I's and crossing all the T's from a legal compliance perspective for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Legal, HR, tech for sure. I think procurement as well. A lot of times, if it's a contingent use case, the contingent workforce program rolls up to procurement or sourcing, especially in larger companies, and they'll have some feedback on how they want the program to run with an EOR involved. So if you're sort of architecting this RFP for the first time, you might want to get some of those stakeholders involved. Think about those departments within your organization, um, and sort of loop them in. I also think your departments that are getting looped in will depend on sort of the scenario you're in. So what are some of the things to consider as far as scenarios are concerned that might impact the RFP structure, Julie, that you've maybe seen in the past?
Well, I think, that the greater the volume, the more likely you are going to see an RFP. And I think the more critical it is to do an extremely deep dive into the potential EORs. So, if you're talking just an RFP for maybe a head count of 50, you might not be as critical with all of the questions that you're asking to vet that EOR versus if you're going to be giving them a workforce of, say, 250 employees. The more placements that you've got on the line, the more critical it is that you vet that EOR to make sure that they can really meet all of your needs. That's for sure. Um, when you're looking at where are you going to scale into? If you're talking 2 new work states versus 30 new work states, that's going to be a case where you definitely need to vet that EOR. And also if you're looking at 1099 placements versus W-2 placements, all of those workforce scenarios can impact, how you craft that RFP for the EORs.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think to your point, volume is probably one of the most important things to consider, along with the population themselves. Like, what types of workers are we talking about here, right? Are these super
Yeah.
high-end healthcare workers that are used to one experience, or are these entry-level roles that maybe this is their first job and they're doing physical labor, or they're working in technology, right? Like, there's a number of different niche types of use cases that might demand um, different types of EOR support. So I think those are all super important to consider from a use case perspective. But generally, what would you say, Julie, are the most critical capabilities of all EORs to look for on RFPs, like the main, meat and potatoes of a vendor's services?
I would say legal and compliance definitely rank up there pretty high. I mean, you have to ensure that that EOR is following all the labor laws, that the taxes, the benefit requirements, sick time has crept up in the past decade, and it's crazy the amount of variances that are in the sick time.
Right.
Um, I think the ability to scale is very critical when you are evaluating the EORs. Do they have the head count? Do they have the experience to be able to grow with you and to expand into new territories? I also think the technology is humongous. Does that EOR have the technology platform to service the account, whether that's for the onboarding piece, the timekeeping piece, updating any onboarding paperwork if somebody wants to change their W-4 form, how they can access their W-2s, their timesheet stubs, or their pay stubs, um, the security that that organization has to house all of that data is humongous as well. So those are what I would consider the top capabilities that EOR should have, and what that client wants to dive into in that RFP process for sure.
Yeah, I think the two most underrated things to consider, not all the things you said, but the two most underrated things to consider that I would put high on the list. One is onboarding.
Hmm.
The way EORs do onboarding is very different across vendors. Some say you do all of it and just give it to us. Others say we will handle this all for you. And that could be even specific to a difficult industry like healthcare, which requires credentialing and all these other things. Knowing what you need there and understanding what you want it to look like is super important. You can't take for granted that all EORs do the onboarding the same way. That is not the case. So that's number one. Number two is time and attendance, especially on the US use case. And if you have complex time and attendance needs, you're going to really want to understand how is this EOR going to gather time from our workers, whether there's a VMS involved or not. Do they have a technology or not? Is that technology good? Is it compliant even? There's some VMSs out there that don't even comply with the laws for time and attendance. So I think there's extreme amounts of importance there that are usually overlooked as some critical capabilities to really vet out when you're looking at EORs. And you mentioned compliance and legal. How can you, or how have you seen maybe some of these buyers vet out that legal and compliance expertise?
I think gathering references and actually contacting those references is huge for those clients to see, what has the experience been of other companies that have worked with the EOR. That's a huge one. Um, because obviously that client is going to want their workers to be satisfied. They're not going to want to deal with the headaches. If they happen to choose an EOR that's not fulfilling their end of the bargain, that client is definitely not going to be happy in that situation. So, I think doing that and also asking questions in the RFP process that get very specific, that, talk about that EOR's experience, or if they've had any judgments against them, or if they've had any scenarios, where there was some non-compliance, ask those real life cases. Don't be afraid to dig into those questions that when you're developing that RFP process, because that's your opportunity to learn everything about the prospective EOR that's going to be your partner. So that's the critical time frame to do it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's one of the main reasons why you work with an EOR is to make sure that legal and compliance is handled. So, one of the other areas I would highlight is licensing. So a lot of the industries that
Mhm.
people use EORs for require special licensing, whether that's staffing and recruiting, those are special licenses there. Also healthcare, there's special license requirements there. So I would just ask some of those questions because you as a buyer may not even know that an EOR might need a healthcare staffing license to support EOR in the healthcare clinical space. So asking some of those questions, seeing if they have some of that is important to ensuring that things are covered and they're not saying, yeah, everything's good, right? Because
Definitely.
they may not be checking the box.
And it's not uncommon for those clients to require we provide some of that documentation in the RFP process. I mean, I would definitely encourage it if they're going to be thorough, to get those documents, the certificate of insurance, the
Yep,
certificate of good standing, those healthcare licensing requirements that you mentioned, definitely
absolutely.
don't be afraid to ask for the copies.
For sure. And if they can't produce it, that's a red flag.
Mhm.
Right. And I guess what are some of the other red flags to look out for when vetting
If
some EORs?
if I'm in the client's shoes,
Yep.
I would say, that it's definitely a caution if you're seeing an EOR that's less than a year old, you want to make sure that they've been around for a number of years to get the experience there. That's for sure. Um, I would say that's probably one of the biggest red flags. Or, if you get, a client that wasn't happy with the services when you're digging into those reference calls, that's definitely a concern, because who of us wants to give use a bad reference. So if you're not getting a good reference, then, there's something there, for
Mhm.
sure. Um, I'd say an EOR that doesn't really have much experience working with the different states, they might be servicing the accounts very well that they've got, but if they don't have the ability to expand into other states and to know those laws, that might be a concern if they don't seem to have a large enough staff to support that client's needs. And again, like if they're kind of siloed into, oh, well, they're, domiciled in the state of Indiana, and, that's pretty much the only state that they service, they probably aren't going to be able to really meet your needs as a client if you need assistance in, let's say, 25 to 30 states. They
Yeah.
probably aren't going to be able to keep up with you.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you'll see that more with the staffing firms that say they offer EOR services. They're more regional staffing firms. They're not as national as EOR platforms are. So you might want to ask that question if you're getting proposals from staffing firms that also sell EOR services. Um, I also think there's some red flags that exist around um, some of the different technologies that are used, right? Like, do they have their own
Mhm.
technology? Are they borrowing technology, basically repackaging it for you? Like, you want to ask, like, what is the technology? Do you own it? Um, are you going to switch it out? How often have you switched it out, right? Because all those things are going to affect you as a customer if you ultimately go forward with them. So I think that's a big one to look into as well.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
Let's go on the flip side. Why do you think, from a vendor's perspective, some of us EORs decline RFP requests just because of the way they're set up? What are some of the things that we are looking for that we're just like, this probably isn't going to be a good fit for us because of the way the buyer set up the RFP?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, I think the EORs are evaluating the potential volume and profits that you're looking at, I mean, if we're going to be getting an RFP that has a really, really low volume or spend, it's probably not going to be top on our priority list to do. But I think, we look at the complexities that are involved in the RFP process itself. One of the first things we're going to evaluate is the types of positions that we're going to be asked to fill. If they are not roles that an EOR is comfortable with from a risk perspective, whether that would be from workers' compensation coverage or liability coverage, then it's probably one that an EOR is going to pass over if they just don't have the required insurance coverages in place. And I also think just like the onboarding complexities involved of like the amount of paperwork that we'd have to complete, or if we'd have to use several of their preferred vendors. It just makes things complicated. Not that an EOR would necessarily turn it away, but just that there might be more hoops that they would have to jump through to be able to service that account.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing for what we've seen is if they're not going to provide exclusivity as well, they might give, volume estimates, but then they're saying, well, we might then after the
Mhm.
fact award this to multiple vendors and split this up across multiple vendors. And for EORs, that's really not tenable because they're basing their pricing and um, their ability to deliver on the volume that you're projecting. And if you're projecting in either smaller volume than previously thought, or you're not clarifying how much volume, you can't tell them how much volume you're going to get. You're really not going to get much support from vendors on that. So, if you
Yeah.
want to run a good RFP, part of the process is getting vendors to respond and compete for your business, and it's got to be a good relationship for them in order to attract the best vendors possible. So that, along with pricing, making sure you allow them to price the way they need to, I think is super important as well, or else you're going to get some pushback there. So these are all things to consider when you're looking at an EOR. An RFP is a great way to vet vendors for EOR services. We do offer an EOR RFP toolkit, which you can find in the comments It's very helpful in sort of organizing and making the RFP process easier. So if you found this valuable, that might be a great next step. If not, no worries. Hope you found the call and the conversation interesting. And we'll see you next time on how to get away with staffing. Thanks, Julie.
You're welcome. See you guys later.